Imagine walking into the court of a medieval king or queen. The hall is glittering with gold, tapestries hang from the walls, servants bustle about, and in the middle of it all, you see a snow-white peacock strutting proudly across the floor. Over in the corner, a hooded falcon sits perched on a nobleman's arm, its sharp eyes scanning the room. And just behind the throne, a massive chained leopard pacing back and forth, its spotted coat gleaming in the torchlight. Welcome to the world of medieval pets, where animals were not just companions, but living symbols of wealth, power, and prestige. In the Middle Ages, owning a rare or unusual creature was like driving the most luxurious car or wearing the most expensive designer brand today. It was a public statement. I am important enough to own this animal and powerful enough to keep it alive. But what counted as a pet back then was very different from what we think of today. Yes, cats and dogs were common companions, but so were bears, monkeys, hawks, and even lions. The richer and more powerful you were, the stranger your choice of animal tended to be. Let's start with the royalty and nobility, because these were the people who truly turned pet ownership into a medieval art form. Kings and queens were constantly trying to outdo each other with the most exotic animals they could find. Trade routes and crusades brought creatures from far-off lands into Europe, and monarchs saw them as perfect gifts or political tools. If you wanted to impress a ruler, you didn't send them gold or jewels, you sent them an elephant. One famous example comes from 1255, when King Louis IX of France gifted King Henry III of England a live elephant. The animal was housed in the Tower of London, and it became an instant sensation. People traveled from miles around to catch a glimpse of this colossal creature, something most medieval Europeans had never even imagined before. Of course, nobody really knew how to care for an elephant in England's climate, and sadly it only lived a few years. But in that short time, it became a living legend. And then there were the leopards. Oh, medieval rulers loved leopards. The English kings kept them as royal pets for centuries, parading them during processions to intimidate foreign guests. Leopards were seen as symbols of courage and strength, traits every monarch wanted to claim for themselves. But keeping a leopard wasn't just for show, it was also a dangerous power move. These animals were unpredictable, and owning one said, "I am powerful enough to command a creature that could kill you in seconds." Falcons and hawks were another favorite among nobles. Falconry wasn't just a sport, it was a display of refined skill, patience, and authority. A trained falcon could cost as much as a small castle, and only the wealthy could afford them. Kings often posed for portraits with their prized birds, making sure the message was clear: I control nature itself. Of course, not all medieval pets were dangerous predators or regal birds of prey. Some were just unusual. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, was said to have kept pet songbirds that traveled with her from court to court. They were small, delicate, and easy to transport, but in the opulent world of medieval aristocracy, even tiny creatures were chosen with care for the impression they made. But here's where things get really fascinating. In many cases, medieval pet ownership wasn't just about the animals themselves. It was about what those animals represented in art, literature, and heraldry. A ruler might own a greyhound not just because it was a loyal hunting companion, but because in medieval symbolism, the greyhound represented loyalty, bravery, and nobility. Every creature had a deeper meaning, and by keeping that animal close, you were essentially wrapping yourself in those qualities. And the strangest part? Many medieval rulers kept their pets right in the palace, walking freely among courtiers and guests. The smell, the mess, the noise, none of it mattered if it made you look powerful and mysterious. A medieval throne room could be a place of political negotiations, and also the occasional awkward moment where someone had to step around a peacock blocking the way to the king. But the medieval love of animals didn't stay confined to the royal courts. As we'll see in the next part, even ordinary townsfolk had their own strange companions, and sometimes their choice of pet could mean the difference between life and death. When you imagine medieval peasants, you probably think of muddy fields, hard labor, and the occasional chicken running loose in the yard. And you'd be right, but those chickens might not have been dinner. In many cases, they were cherished companions. For ordinary people in the Middle Ages, animals were often both pets and workers. Cats, for example, were kept to catch mice and rats. But they were also loved as affectionate household members. Medieval art often shows cats curled up by the hearth or weaving between a woman's skirts. They were a source of warmth, comfort, and, importantly, pest control in a time when vermin could destroy entire food stores. Dogs were equally popular, but not quite in the way we think of today. The average medieval peasant didn't keep a pampered lapdog. They had sturdy, hard-working breeds that could herd sheep, guard the home, or help with hunting. Still, it wasn't all work and no play. There are records of people naming their dogs, talking to them, and even leaving food out for them when times were hard. In a world where human life was often short and uncertain, these bonds with animals could be deeply emotional. But some pets in the medieval world were unusual, even for the lower classes. For instance, squirrels. Yes, medieval people sometimes kept squirrels as pets. Red squirrels in particular were popular, partly because they were easy to catch, partly because they were adorable, and partly because they could be trained to sit on the shoulder or take food from a hand. In some places, children were known to keep them as a kind of starter pet, though a squirrel's sharp teeth and unpredictable temperament probably made them a risky choice. Monkeys were another surprise, not common, but not unheard of. Exotic animals were usually reserved for the rich, but occasionally, sailors or traders brought back a monkey and sold it in the marketplace. A merchant might buy one to entertain customers, or a wealthy townsman might keep it simply to show off. Monkeys fascinated medieval people. Their human-like movements and expressions made them seem almost magical. Birds were by far the most popular pets for common folk. Songbirds like finches, nightingales, and even magpies were kept in cages or allowed to fly freely in the home. A bird could be a source of joy in the drab monotony of medieval life, and for some, it was a status symbol in miniature. Skilled bird catchers could earn extra money by trapping rare or unusually colorful specimens. But pet ownership for the lower classes wasn't just about companionship or beauty. Sometimes an animal was kept for spiritual or superstitious reasons. A toad in a jar might be thought to ward off illness. A black cat could be a good luck charm, or, depending on local beliefs, a suspected witch's familiar. In some villages, people believed certain animals could detect ghosts or evil spirits, so they were kept as protective guardians. Interestingly, medieval law sometimes protected these human-animal bonds. There are records of disputes in which neighbors went to court over stolen pets. In one 14th century case, a man was fined for taking another man as trained bird, proof that even in an age of plagues and poverty, people valued their animal companions enough to fight for them. Of course, not every medieval pet was truly tame. Some people kept wild creatures, at least for a while. Hedgehogs, for example, were sometimes kept to control garden pests. Fox cubs might be captured and raised for their fur or simply as a novelty. These relationships were often short-lived. Wild instincts don't vanish easily, but they show the medieval fascination with animals of all kinds. And it wasn't just about practicality or affection. In the medieval mind, animals were deeply connected to the human soul. Saints were often depicted with animal companions. From St. Jerome's lion to St. Francis's birds, keeping a pet wasn't just an earthly pleasure. It could be seen as a reflection of divine harmony between man and beast. But the medieval pet world had a dark side too. In some cases, the very animals people loved could become the subject of suspicion, superstition, and even deadly accusations. In the next part, we'll explore the strange and sometimes tragic fates of pets caught up in medieval fears and beliefs. If you were to stroll into the castle gardens of a medieval noble household, you might expect to see knights training or servants tending to flowers, but you might also spot a very different kind of display. Animals that were less about function and more about pure prestige. For the elite of the Middle Ages, pets were more than companions. They were living, breathing symbols of status, wealth, and connection to the wider world. Let's start with falcons and hawks, the crown jewels of medieval pet ownership. Falconry wasn't just a hobby. It was a high art, one that required years of skill and training. The type of bird you owned even reflected your rank in society. Kings might flyger falcons, prized for their size and rarity, while knights and lords might settle for peregrines or sparrowhawks. These birds were expensive, temperamental, and required specialized care, but that was part of their allure. The fact that they were difficult to keep only made them more impressive as a display of status. And the accessories, just as important as the bird itself. Falcons wore hoods hand-stitched from fine leather. Perches were decorated, and some birds were even adorned with tiny bells. When a noble rode out with a falcon perched regally on their gloved hand, it sent a clear message. I have the resources, leisure, and refinement to keep and train such a creature. Then there were the lapdogs, the medieval equivalent of luxury handbags, if luxury handbags could wag their tails and lick your face. Breeds like the ancestor of the modern Maltese, Pekingese, and Bichon Frise were favored by noble women. These little dogs were small enough to sit on a lady's lap during court gatherings, their silky fur brushed and perfumed. Some were even fed diets richer than the peasants' meals, enjoying roasted meats or sweet treats. Their collars could be studded with jewels, not for the dog's benefit, but as yet another reminder to onlookers of their owner's wealth. Cats also made their way into noble courts, though their reputation was far more complicated. In some circles, cats were admired for their elegance and hunting skill, keeping palace storerooms free of mice. In others, their mysterious, independent nature and the lingering superstitions that connected them to witchcraft meant they were kept more cautiously. Still, a sleek, well-fed cat lounging in a lady's chambers was a subtle marker of refinement. But the nobility didn't stop at falcons, dogs, and cats. Exotic animals were the ultimate flex, proof that you had connections beyond your own kingdom. Wealthy merchants and noble families returning from far-off lands sometimes brought back parrots, peacocks, or even monkeys. These creatures were astonishing to the medieval imagination. A brightly colored parrot could speak, or at least mimic speech, which seemed almost magical. Peacocks, with their shimmering tails, were paraded around as if they were living treasures. Monkeys, while mischievous and prone to chaos, were dressed in tiny costumes for the amusement of guests. Of course, the reality of keeping these exotic pets was not as glamorous as it appeared. Parrots needed warmth and special diets. Monkeys could be destructive and aggressive. But in an age when most people had never seen such animals outside of illustrated manuscripts, just owning one, even if it lived in a small cage, elevated your reputation enormously. These pets also played a role in courtly politics. Giving a rare or exotic animal as a gift could forge alliances and curry favor. Historical records tell of monarchs exchanging lions, leopards, and other remarkable creatures as diplomatic tokens. To receive such a gift was to be acknowledged as powerful and important, and to decline it was almost an insult. It is worth remembering that these status pets weren't kept out of pure affection, at least not in the way we think of pets today. They were statements. They were a way of saying, I am above the daily grind of survival. I have the means to care for a creature that provides nothing practical in return. In a time when even basic necessities could be hard to come by, that message carried enormous weight. Still, it would be unfair to say there was no genuine bond between nobles and their high-status pets. Portraits from the period sometimes show noblewomen cradling their small dogs with tenderness or falconers gazing at their birds with pride. While prestige was the driving force behind these animals' presence in elite households, companionship and affection did find a place. In many ways, the medieval obsession with status pets has echoes in our own time. Today, luxury dog breeds, rare parrots, or even unusual reptiles still carry a sense of prestige. We post them on social media, not unlike nobles showing them off in the castle courtyard. The medieval castle garden might be gone, but the impulse to impress with our animals hasn't entirely faded. And as we move deeper into our journey through medieval pet ownership, we'll see that the contrast between noble luxury pets and the working animals of everyday people couldn't have been starker. And yet, both worlds reveal fascinating truths about how humans have always related to the creatures around them. If peasants and townsfolk had to worry about superstition when keeping a pet, the nobility lived in an entirely different world. For them, an animal was not just a companion, it was a statement. The more exotic or unusual the pet, the more it proclaimed the owner's wealth, power, and connections. In the courts of medieval Europe, owning a rare animal was like wearing the finest crown jewels. A sleek greyhound, bred for speed and elegance, might lie curled at a noble's feet during a feast, a living emblem of refinement. In fact, greyhounds were so prized that commoners were often forbidden by law to own them. In England, the forest laws reserved certain breeds for the nobility, and woe to the peasant caught with one. But greyhounds were only the beginning. Falcons and hawks were perhaps the most prestigious pets of all. Falconry wasn't just a sport. It was an art form and a symbol of noble virtue. A trained peregrine falcon could cost as much as a small estate. Kings and queens were painted with their favorite birds perched on a gloved hand, feathers gleaming, eyes sharp. To see a noble riding out with a hooded falcon was to witness power in motion. Then there were the truly exotic animals, brought to Europe through trade, diplomacy, or sheer extravagance. Monkeys, for instance, were a favorite among the wealthy elite. These creatures fascinated medieval audiences with their human-like expressions and mischievous antics. Kept in gilded cages or allowed to roam chambers, monkeys were as much entertainment as they were pets, though their tendency to steal food and bite fingers meant they weren't always the most peaceful companions. Some nobles went even further. Leopards, lions, and other big cats occasionally appeared in royal menageries, gifts from distant rulers. Owning such a creature wasn't about companionship, it was about spectacle. A caged lion in the castle courtyard told visitors, "I have the wealth and influence to bring the wild to my doorstep." In 13th century England, King Henry III famously kept a polar bear, a gift from the King of Norway in the Tower of London. The bear was even allowed to swim and fish in the Thames, drawing gawking crowds. Small lapdogs also became deeply fashionable among noblewomen, not just for their charm, but for their symbolic value. Breeds like the Bichon or Maltese were adored for their delicate size and silky coats, often dressed in ribbons or jeweled collars. These tiny dogs weren't expected to work or hunt. Their entire role was to exist as an accessory, a living ornament to display their owner's refinement. Paintings from the era often show noble ladies holding these pampered pets, the bond between them a mix of genuine affection and social performance. Even birds beyond hawks had a place in the upper-class household. Songbirds, parrots, and even peacocks were kept for their beauty and their voices. A parrot could be a marvel in a medieval hall, mimicking speech and drawing laughter from guests. Peacocks, on the other hand, often roamed gardens. Their feathers a dazzling show of luxury and occasionally appearing on the dining table, roasted but redressed in their feathers for dramatic effect. For the nobility, the care of these animals was a serious matter. Servants were tasked with feeding, cleaning, and training them, sometimes at great expense. Special diets were prepared, and some animals even had dedicated attendants. It wasn't too unusual for a noble esaul to leave money specifically for the upkeep of a beloved pet after their death, but there was also a darker side to noble pet ownership. Exotic animals often suffered in captivity, far from their natural habitats. Monkeys might be chained or caged in cramped quarters. Lions and leopards were confined for life, never able to roam freely. Even pampered lapdogs could face health problems from overindulgence or inbreeding. In many ways, these creatures were more symbols than companions, living trophies that paid the price for human vanity. Still, the allure of the unusual pet was irresistible to the medieval elite. They were a way to display power without words, to impress guests and intimidate rivals. And for some, they were genuinely loved companions, remembered fondly in poems, portraits, and chronicles. In the next part, we'll look at the world of working animals, the unsung, unglamorous pets that shared daily life with medieval people. They weren't bred for beauty or status, but for skill, loyalty, and survival. And sometimes those bonds ran deeper than any royal falcon or jeweled lapdog. When we think of medieval pets, it's easy to picture exotic monkeys in noble courts or pampered lapdogs nestled in silk pillows. But for most medieval people, animals weren't about luxury or display. They were about survival. And yet, even the hardest working animals often became something more than tools. They became trusted companions, valued for their loyalty as much as their labor. Dogs were the most common working animals in medieval towns and countryside alike. Farmers relied on large, sturdy breeds to guard flocks from wolves and thieves. These guard dogs often lived outdoors, roaming fields and sleeping beside the sheep they protected. Though they had jobs to do, they frequently developed bonds with their human families, following children home, begging scraps in the kitchen, or curling up by the fire when the day's work was done. In villages, smaller terrier-type dogs kept houses free from rats and mice, an invaluable service when plague and famine lurked in every corner. Cats, though often treated with suspicion because of their association with witchcraft, were also indispensable in many households. In barns, bakeries, and grain stores, a good mouser was worth its weight in gold. Cats lived on the fringes of human society, independent, wary, and not always treated as members of the family, yet many people couldn't help but form attachments to them. Medieval manuscripts even contain notes written by monks about cats knocking over inkpots or curling up on warm parchments, proof that affection could thrive even in the most practical of relationships. Horses were perhaps the most respected working companions. While war horses and destriers belonged to the world of knights, the average medieval family relied on more humble breeds for transportation, plowing, and carrying goods to market. A strong, sure-footed cart horse was a lifeline, and caring for it was a priority. Many families spoke of their horses almost as if they were family members, praising their temperament, their strength, even their stubbornness. Then there were less obvious working pets, animals that were technically kept for a purpose, but often became beloved in the process. Pigs, for example, roamed freely in some towns, rooting through waste and providing meat when the time came. Some households became so attached to them that slaughtering was postponed or avoided altogether. Chickens, too, could develop a special place in a family's heart, especially if they had unusual markings, laid especially large eggs, or followed their owners around the yard. In monasteries, working animals often became part of the community. Donkeys and oxen helped with farming, but they were also cared for with unusual gentleness, reflecting the monks' belief that all creatures were part of God's creation. There are even records of abbots ordering extra food for old or sick animals that could no longer work, a rare kindness in an age when most animals had to earn their keep. Working animals also played a vital role in law enforcement and security. In towns, watchmen sometimes kept trained guard dogs to patrol at night. These dogs weren't pampered pets, but their loyalty and sharp senses made them invaluable. In rural areas, dogs trained for hunting were treasured not just for the food they helped provide, but for their skill and personality. A good hunting dog could mean the difference between a feast and an empty table. It's worth noting that while the bond between humans and working animals could be deep, medieval life was still harsh. A dog that failed to guard, a cat that didn't catch mice, or a horse that couldn't pull its weight might quickly lose its place. Yet for those that proved themselves, the reward was often lifelong care, scraps from the family table, and a kind of affection that transcended their usefulness. In many ways, these working animals were the unsung heroes of medieval pet ownership. They didn't wear jeweled collars or live in gilded cages, but they shaped daily life in ways that no exotic falcon or courtly monkey could. Their companionship was built not on novelty or prestige, but on trust, shared labor, and mutual dependence. In the next part, we'll step into the stranger corners of medieval history, where pet ownership crossed into the realm of the bizarre, with animals that blurred the line between companion, curiosity, and outright oddity. Now, let's step away from the farmyard and the working fields and wander into the more eccentric side of medieval pet keeping. The animals that didn't served much practical purpose, but fascinated their owners simply by existing. These were the creatures that turned heads, sparked gossip, and sometimes made people question whether their owners had entirely lost their minds. First up, monkeys. Exotic, unpredictable, and utterly impractical. Monkeys became something of a status symbol among the wealthy elite of medieval Europe. Imported from Africa or Asia through complex trade networks, these creatures were expensive to acquire and even more expensive to keep alive in a cold northern climate. Medieval paintings often depict small monkeys perched on the shoulders of noblewomen, or chained to a post in the background of a grand hall. Their role wasn't to guard, to work, or to hunt. They were living novelties. Of course, monkeys being monkeys, they also had a reputation for mischief, stealing jewelry, appending bowls of food, or imitating guests in ways that caused either laughter or offense. Then there were pet squirrels. Yes, squirrels. In an age when hunting was a favored pastime, some people captured wild squirrels, tamed them, and kept them in delicate wooden cages. Their quick darting movements and fluffy tails made them popular among women and children. In some cases, squirrels were even allowed to roam free inside the home, though this often ended in chewed furniture or raided food stores. Still, their novelty outweighed the inconvenience for those determined to own one. Hedgehogs were another unusual choice. While farmers sometimes encouraged them in gardens to eat pests, others took them in as companions. Their small size, distinctive look, and gentle nature made them something of a curiosity. There were even superstitions about hedgehogs bringing good luck, provided they were treated kindly. Of course, the idea of cuddling something covered in spines is questionable at best, but medieval people were not easily deterred by practicality. We also find evidence of pet birds that went far beyond the falcons and hawks of noble hunts. Parrots, brought from warmer climates, were prized for their bright feathers and ability to mimic speech. Canaries and songbirds found their way into households for their beauty and cheerful music. In courts, exotic birds were sometimes used as conversation pieces during banquets, a kind of living entertainment that added to the host's prestige. Even stranger were the occasional wild animals kept as pets by eccentric nobles. There are records of small bears, foxes, and even wolves being raised from cubs and treated as household companions. In one infamous case, a French nobleman kept a pet leopard, which he claimed was as gentle as a dog, though his servants might have told a very different story. Not all of these strange pets belonged to the rich. In villages, children might adopt orphaned wild animals, a young crow, a rabbit, or even a toad, and keep them until they were either too wild to handle or too large to manage. These creatures became temporary friends, companions in a childhood otherwise filled with work and routine. But perhaps the most peculiar medieval pets were those kept not for their cuteness, but for their supposed magical or medicinal properties. Some people kept toads or snakes because they believed they could cure illnesses or ward off evil spirits. Others kept certain birds, like owls, for their association with wisdom, even if it meant feeding an animal that refused to behave like a traditional pet. These strange and unusual pets remind us that medieval people, for all their practicality and superstition, shared a timeless human trait, curiosity. They were drawn to the unusual, the rare, and the exotic. Not unlike people today who keep tarantulas, sugar gliders, or reptiles in their homes. The difference is, in the Middle Ages, owning such a creature could set you apart as a person of wealth, mystery, or eccentric charm, sometimes all three at once. In the next part, we'll dive into the fascinating symbolism and cultural meaning that medieval society attached to their animal companions, because in the Middle Ages, a pet was rarely just a pet. In the medieval world, animals weren't just animals. They were symbols, living metaphors that could reflect a person's virtues, vices, status, or even their soul. A pet wasn't simply a furry friend. It was a statement to the world about who you were, what you believed, and where you stood in the grand hierarchy of life. For instance, dogs, especially small lapdogs, were often associated with loyalty and faithfulness. In illuminated manuscripts, noblewomen are sometimes shown holding or playing with tiny dogs, a visual shorthand for chastity and devotion. These images weren't accidental. They were designed to signal a person's moral character as much as their wealth. Of course, in daily life, these little dogs also served as warm, living handmuffs in drafty castles, a practical benefit wrapped in layers of symbolism. Cats, on the other hand, carried a more complex and often contradictory meaning. While they were valued for keeping vermin at bay, they were also linked to cunning, independence, and even witchcraft. In art, a cat curled at a woman's feet could suggest domesticity, but in other contexts it might hint at seduction or mischief. It all depended on the artist's intention and the audience's interpretation. Birds were rich in symbolic meaning. Falcons, as part of noble hunting traditions, represented nobility, skill, and power. A trained falcon perched on a nobleman's wrist was the medieval equivalent of arriving in a luxury car, a sign of prestige that everyone immediately recognized. Songbirds, meanwhile, symbolized joy, love, and the pleasures of life. Parrots, being exotic, spoke of wealth, exploration, and a connection to far-off lands. Even the more unusual pets carried their own layers of meaning. Monkeys, for example, often symbolized vanity and foolishness, a reflection of human vices. In medieval art, a monkey might be shown mimicking human behavior to poke fun at society's pride and greed. For a noble to own one could be a way of showing worldliness, or a subtle admission of indulgence in life's frivolities. Some animals had overtly religious symbolism. Lambs represented purity and innocence, drawing a direct link to Christ. Doves symbolized peace and the Holy Spirit, making them popular in religious imagery and as symbolic pets in convents. Even rabbits, common enough in the countryside, were linked to fertility and rebirth, ideas that could be interpreted both in a sacred and in a more earthly, sensual sense. The symbolism wasn't always positive. Certain creatures carried ominous meanings. Owls, for example, were sometimes associated with wisdom, but just as often they represented death or bad omens in European folklore. Snakes, kept by some for medicinal or mystical purposes, were linked to temptation and evil because of the biblical story of Eden. For medieval pet owners, these layers of meaning mattered. A nobleman parading through town with a falcon was making a public statement about his skill and status. A lady keeping a snowy white lapdog wasn't just indulging in cuteness, she was projecting virtue and refinement. Even peasants might be aware of these associations, whether they embraced or defied them. Understanding these symbols helps us see that the medieval relationship with pets was about far more than companionship. Animals were woven into the fabric of medieval identity. They were living emblems chosen not only for their appearance or usefulness, but for the ideas they represented. And in our final part, we'll explore how these medieval attitudes toward pets, from the practical to the symbolic, evolved over time, and how they still echo in the way we think about animals today. As we close our journey through the world of medieval pets, it's worth asking, what happened to these strange companions, and what legacy did they leave behind? The truth is, while much has changed in the centuries since knights rode through castle gates and queens strolled through palace gardens, our relationships with animals are still shaped by habits and beliefs born in that era. Many medieval pet traditions quietly transformed into modern ones. Take dogs, for example. The tiny lapdogs of noble women, once prized for their warmth and loyalty, are now beloved companion breeds like the Maltese, Pomeranian, or Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. Their role as status symbols might have faded for most of us, but the idea of dogs as loyal friends, a belief deeply rooted in medieval thought, remains as strong as ever. Cats, once both cherished and feared, have followed a similar path. In medieval Europe, a black cat might have been a sign of witchcraft. Today, it's just as likely to be someone's spoiled house pet lounging on the sofa. Yet the medieval association between cats and independence, mystery, and self-possession still lingers in the way we talk about them. Even the lingering superstition about black cats crossing your path has its roots in those darker centuries. Some of the more exotic pets, like monkeys and parrots, fell out of favor as the world modernized. The practice of keeping such animals in private homes became rare, replaced by public zoos or aviaries. Still, the medieval fascination with the exotic has survived in our ongoing love for unique and unusual pets, from tropical fish to reptiles, and in the status people sometimes attach to owning something rare. The symbolic meanings of animals have also endured, though they've shifted over time. Falcons may no longer ride on noble wrists, but they remain powerful cultural symbols of vision, speed, and prestige. Lambs, doves, and other creatures still carry religious and poetic associations. Even the medieval habit of reading a person's character through their choice of animal hasn't disappeared entirely. We just call it something else now. like dog person or cat person. There's also a deeper legacy in how medieval people balanced practicality with affection. For them, animals had to serve a purpose, hunting, guarding, catching pests, but they also held a place in the heart. That blend of utility and companionship is still visible today, whether in working dogs on farms or therapy animals in hospitals. Of course, not all aspects of medieval pet keeping were charming. Exotic animals were often taken from their native habitats with little thought for their well-being. Many creatures were kept in conditions we would consider cruel today. Over time, our understanding of animal welfare has grown, and laws now protect many species from the treatment that was once common. And yet, when you look closely, the thread from the medieval past to our modern homes is easy to see. A child playing with a puppy in a small village today is not so different from a medieval child doing the same centuries ago. A wealthy person showing off their purebred dog on social media echoes a lady in a castle courtyard proudly holding her jeweled-collared lapdog. The emotional bond, that unspoken language of trust and affection between humans and animals, has never really changed. In the end, medieval pet owners weren't so different from us. They loved, they cared for, they laughed at, and they sometimes mourned their animals just as we do, whether their companions had fur, feathers, or scales. They brought joy, comfort, and a sense of connection to the natural world. So, the next time your cat curls up in your lap, your dog wags its tail when you walk through the door, or your parrot greets you with a squawk, remember that you re part of a tradition stretching back hundreds, even thousands of years. A tradition that links you to knights, queens, peasants, and merchants, all united by the simple, enduring magic of sharing life with another creature.